When desperate widower Jacob Mackenzie traded his last 2 chickens for a mail-order bride in 1867 Montana Territory, he expected to buy himself a quiet housekeeper to help him survive the brutal winter ahead. But Catherine Walsh arrived with secrets, intelligence, and a voice that would transform not just his lonely ranch, but challenge everything the frontier believed about a woman's worth. So what did she do that shocked the entire West and made him realize some things can never truly be bought or sold? Jacob Mackenzie's boots hit the wooden porch with a sound like gunshots in the morning silence. The Montana Territory sun blazed down on his ranch in August 1867, turning everything to gold and dust. But gold couldn't fill the empty spaces where laughter used to live. He wiped sweat from his face with a dirty sleeve. The fence post stood crooked now, like broken teeth in an old man's mouth. 6 months ago, his wife Mary had fixed them with her own hands while their boy Tommy played nearby. Now the typhoid fever had taken them both, leaving Jacob alone with memories that cut deeper than any knife. The chickens scratched in the dirt, making soft sounds that reminded him of better days. These 2 hens were all he had left of the farm animals. The cows, the pigs, the horses, all sold to pay for medicine that never came fast enough. His hands shook as he scattered feed for the birds. Even these simple creatures seemed to know something was wrong. "Come on, girls," he whispered to the chickens. "At least you 2 are still here." The wind picked up, carrying dust across the empty yard. Jacob squinted toward the horizon, where the mountains touched the sky like purple fingers. Somewhere out there, other families were probably sitting down to breakfast together. Children asking for second helpings. Wives humming while they cooked. The simple happiness he'd once known felt like a dream now. His stomach growled, but the idea of eating alone again made him sick. The kitchen table was too big for one person. Everything in the house was too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts. He tried talking to Mary's picture on the mantel, but even her painted smile couldn't talk back. A sound made him look up. Dust rose from the road like smoke. Someone was coming, and in these parts, visitors usually meant trouble or business. Jacob's hand moved to the gun on his hip. Living alone had taught him to be careful. The visitor rode a fancy wagon with a canvas top, pulled by 2 horses that looked too well-fed for honest work. The man driving wore a city hat and a smile that seemed painted on his face. Everything about him screamed stranger and danger. "Good morning, friend," the man called out, waving like they were old buddies. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Jacob didn't answer. Beautiful was not the word he'd use for any day lately. The stranger climbed down from his wagon, moving like a man who thought he owned the world. "Name's Cornelius Briggs," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm in the business of helping folks in difficult situations." "Not interested," Jacob said quickly. Men like this usually wanted to buy his land for almost nothing. But Briggs just laughed. Now, don't be so hasty. I haven't told you what I'm offering yet." His eyes moved around the ranch, taking in the broken fences, the empty animal pens, the general sadness of the place. "I can see you're a man who's had some hard times recently." Jacob's jaw tightened. News traveled fast in small towns. Everyone knew about Mary and Tommy, about his money troubles, about how he could barely keep the ranch running. It made him angry that strangers knew his business. "What do you want?" he asked. Briggs walked closer, his boots clicking on the hard ground. "I want to help you, Mr. Mackenzie. I deal in, shall we say, domestic arrangements. Solutions for lonely men who need companionship." The words hit Jacob like cold water. He'd heard whispers about men like Briggs, traveling salesmen who traded in human misery. They preyed on desperate people, offering deals that sounded too good to be true. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob lied. "Oh, I think you do." Briggs pointed toward the chicken coop. "Those are fine birds you have there. Healthy. Good for laying eggs, I'd imagine." Jacob felt something ugly twist in his stomach. "They're not for sale." "Who said anything about selling?" Briggs grinned wider. "I'm talking about trading. A fair exchange. Your loneliness for companionship. Your empty house for a woman who can cook, clean, and keep you warm during the cold Montana winters." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Jacob wanted to punch this man, to order him off his land. But a tiny voice in his head whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was his only chance to avoid dying alone. What kind of woman would? He started to ask, then stopped. He didn't want to know. Didn't want to think about what kind of life would drive someone to accept such an arrangement. The kind who needs a home as much as you need a companion, Briggs said smoothly. Young ladies from back east who've fallen on hard times. Nothing wrong with them, mind you. Just circumstances that weren't their fault. Jacob looked at his chickens, then back at the stranger. 2 birds for a wife. It sounded impossible and shameful at the same time. But winter was coming, and the bank was breathing down his neck. The loneliness was eating him alive from the inside. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. But don't think too long. I have other stops to make, and good opportunities don't wait forever. Briggs climbed back onto his wagon. I'll be camped by Miller's Creek for 3 days. After that, I head to California. As the wagon rolled away, Jacob stood alone in his yard, staring at the chickens that suddenly seemed like they might be worth more than just eggs and Sunday dinner. The bank letter arrived like a rattlesnake in Jacob's mailbox, its red stamp glaring at him like angry eyes. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. Final notice. Pay up or lose everything. The words burned in his mind as he walked back to the house. Inside, the silence pressed against him like a heavy blanket. Mary's sewing basket still sat by her favorite chair, needle and thread waiting for hands that would never come back. Tommy's wooden horse lay on its side near the fireplace, as if it had fallen asleep waiting for its owner to return. Jacob sat at the kitchen table and spread the letter out next to another piece of mail. His sister Ruth had written from Pennsylvania, her neat handwriting full of gentle suggestions about moving on and starting fresh somewhere civilized. Between the lines, he could read what she really meant. Give up the ranch, sell everything, and come live with her family like a charity case. The coffee in his cup had gone cold hours ago, but he sipped it anyway. Cold coffee was better than the whiskey he really wanted. Drinking wouldn't solve his problems, and he'd seen too many men drown their sorrows until they forgot how to swim back to the surface. Outside, the wind howled like a lonely wolf. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in his bones, smell it in the air. The old-timers said it would be a harsh one, the kind that killed cattle and broke men's spirits. Alone, he might survive it. But the ranch, the dream he'd built with Mary, would die for sure. His mind kept drifting back to Cornelius Briggs and his strange offer. 2 chickens for a bride. The very idea made Jacob's skin crawl, but desperation had a way of making terrible things seem reasonable. He'd heard stories from other men in town, whispered conversations about mail-order wives and arranged marriages. Most folks looked down on such things, but when you were drowning, you grabbed whatever rope was thrown to you. The chickens clucked softly outside, probably wondering why their evening feed was late. Jacob looked at them through the window, trying to imagine a world where they were gone. No more eggs for breakfast. No more gentle sounds to break the silence. But maybe, just maybe, no more eating alone either. He picked up his pen and started to write a letter to Ruth, then stopped. What could he say? That he was thinking about trading livestock for a wife? That he'd fallen so low he was considering buying a woman like she was a piece of farm equipment? Ruth would never understand. She lived in a world where marriages were built on love and courtship, not desperation and chickens. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jacob stood up and paced to the window, then back to the table. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. A man who'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months. His hair was grayer, his face more lined. The spark that Mary had loved was gone, replaced by something hollow and tired. A memory hit him suddenly. Mary laughing as she chased Tommy around the yard, both of them covered in mud from the garden. She'd looked at Jacob with such joy, such love, that he'd felt like the luckiest man alive. Now that same yard was empty, and the garden was nothing but weeds. "What would you do, Mary?" he whispered to the empty room. "What would you tell me to do?" But Mary was gone, and the dead didn't give advice to the living. Jacob walked to the bedroom and pulled out a small wooden box from under the bed. Inside were Mary's jewelry, nothing fancy, just a few pieces her mother had given her. The wedding ring caught the lamplight, a simple gold band that had meant everything to both of them. He could sell it, add the money to what he had saved. But the thought of parting with it made his chest ache. He closed the box and put it back under the bed. Some things were too precious to trade, even for survival. The wind rattled the windows, and Jacob pulled his coat tighter. 3 days, Briggs had said. 3 days to decide whether to trade his chickens for a chance at not dying alone. 3 days to choose between his pride and his survival. He thought about the woman who might come with such an arrangement. What kind of life had she lived? What circumstances had driven her to accept marriage to a stranger in exchange for chickens? Was she as desperate as he was? Or was she something else entirely? The questions swirled in his mind like leaves in a tornado. But underneath them all was a simpler truth. Winter was coming, and he wasn't sure he could face it alone. Jacob blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the wind sing its lonely song. Tomorrow he would have to make a choice that would change everything. Tonight, he would sit with his ghosts and try to find the courage to either stay or go. The chickens had stopped clucking outside. Even they knew when it was time to find shelter from the storm. Jacob's hands trembled as he caught the first chicken, its feathers soft and warm against his rough palms. The morning mist hung over Miller's Creek like a ghost, and somewhere in that fog waited Cornelius Briggs with his covered wagon and his terrible bargain. "Easy, girl," Jacob whispered to the hen, but his voice cracked like a teenage boy's. The bird seemed to sense his fear, clucking nervously as he tucked her under his left arm. The second chicken proved harder to catch, as if she knew what was coming. Each step toward the creek felt like walking to his own hanging. The grass was wet with dew that soaked through his worn boots, making his feet cold and uncomfortable. But the chill in his toes was nothing compared to the ice in his stomach. What kind of man trades living creatures for a wife? What kind of man had he become? The wagon sat beside the water like a dark secret. Smoke rose from a small campfire where Briggs was cooking breakfast, bacon that smelled better than anything Jacob had eaten in months. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd been too nervous to eat since yesterday. "Mr. Mackenzie," Briggs called out cheerfully, as if they were meeting for a church picnic instead of this shameful business. "I wondered if you'd come. Coffee's fresh if you want some." Jacob shook his head. Coffee would only make his hands shake worse than they already were. The chickens under his arms felt heavier with each passing second, like they were made of lead instead of feathers and bones. "So," Briggs said, standing up and wiping his hands on a dirty cloth, "have you made your decision?" The words stuck in Jacob's throat. He'd practiced this moment 100 times during the long, sleepless night, but now that it was here, his courage seemed to have run away like a scared rabbit. "The chickens," he finally managed. For the woman." Briggs smiled wider than any man should smile at such a moment. "Excellent choice, my friend. You won't regret this." He reached for the birds, and Jacob found himself pulling back slightly. "What's her name?" The question surprised even Jacob. He hadn't planned to ask. "Miss Catherine Walsh," Briggs replied, taking the chickens with practiced ease. "Fresh from Boston. Educated, well-mannered, excellent cook. You're getting quite a bargain, if I do say so myself." Boston. Jacob had never been further east than Denver, but he'd heard stories about big cities with their fancy buildings and educated people. What was a Boston woman doing in a wagon by a Montana creek, waiting to be traded for farm animals? "Why?" he asked. "Why would she?" "Circumstances, my dear fellow. We all have our circumstances." Briggs secured the chickens in a small crate behind his wagon. "Now, shall we complete our business?" The canvas covering the wagon rustled, and Jacob's heart started beating so fast he thought it might burst. Whatever was about to happen would change his life forever. There would be no going back, no pretending this was all a bad dream. A woman's hand appeared first, pale and slender, pushing the canvas aside. Then came a face that made Jacob forget how to breathe. She wasn't beautiful in the painted lady way of saloon girls, but there was something about her that grabbed his attention and wouldn't let go. Her hair was reddish-brown, pulled back tight like she was trying to hide its prettiness. Her eyes were green as spring grass, but they held a sadness that seemed older than her years. She looked to be about 25, with fine features that spoke of good breeding and education. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that sounded like music compared to the rough speech he was used to. "I'm Catherine Walsh." She climbed down from the wagon with dignity, despite her simple dress and the obvious tiredness in her movements. Jacob noticed that her hands shook slightly, just like his did. She was scared too. "Ma'am," he managed, touching his hat like his mother had taught him years ago. They stood there looking at each other while Briggs bustled around. Gathering his things like this was any ordinary business transaction. The silence stretched between Jacob and Catherine like a rope pulled too tight. "I suppose we should discuss expectations," Catherine said finally, her chin raised in a way that suggested she wasn't as helpless as her situation might indicate. Jacob was struck by her directness. Most women he knew would have been crying or fainting by now. This one stood straight and spoke clearly, as if she was negotiating the price of flour at the general store. "I don't rightly know what to expect," he admitted. This isn't something I ever thought I'd." "None of us thought we'd find ourselves here," Catherine interrupted gently. "But here we are." Briggs finished packing his wagon and climbed up to the driver's seat. "Well, folks, my work here is done. Mr. Mackenzie, treat the lady well. Miss Walsh, you've got yourself a good man and a decent ranch." "Wait," Catherine called out. "My trunk." "Right here, miss." Briggs handed down a small leather trunk that had seen better days. "Everything you own in the world, I'd imagine." The words were cruel, even if they were probably true. Jacob watched Catherine's face flush with embarrassment and felt something protective stir in his chest. This woman, his wife, he supposed, though they hadn't spoken any vows, deserved better than Briggs' casual cruelty. "Thank you for your services," Jacob said stiffly, his dislike for the man growing stronger by the minute. "My pleasure, gentlemen. And lady." Briggs tipped his hat and snapped the reins. "I'll be heading toward California if anyone asks." As the wagon rolled away, Jacob and Catherine were left alone by the creek. The morning mist was lifting, revealing a world that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, even though everything had changed. "Well," Catherine said, picking up her trunk, "I suppose we should go to your ranch and figure out how this is going to work." Jacob reached for the trunk, but she held onto it firmly. "I can carry my own things," she said. He nodded, respecting her small act of independence. As they walked back toward his ranch, Jacob found himself stealing glances at the strange woman who was now supposed to be his wife. She walked with purpose, her back straight despite the weight of her trunk and the uncertainty of her future. "Just so we're clear," she said without looking at him, "I don't expect romance or pretty words. I understand this is a practical arrangement for both of us." Her words should have been a relief, but instead they made Jacob feel oddly disappointed. He'd loved Mary with his whole heart, and the idea of marriage without love seemed as empty as his chicken coop. "Understood," he replied, though he wondered if either of them really understood anything about what they'd just gotten themselves into. Catherine Walsh stood in the doorway of Jacob's cabin like she was entering a tomb instead of a home. Her green eyes took in every detail, the dusty furniture, the cold fireplace, the table set for one person who'd given up caring about proper meals. "It's very," she started, then stopped, probably searching for a polite word for depressing. "It's not much," Jacob finished for her, suddenly seeing his home through her educated Boston eyes. The place looked even sadder than usual, if that was possible. Dirty dishes sat in the wash basin, clothes hung over chair backs, and everything had the gray look of a man who'd stopped trying. Catherine set her trunk down carefully and removed her thin coat. Underneath, her dress was clean but patched in several places. Her shoes had been mended more than once, and her gloves had holes in the fingertips. Whatever circumstances had brought her to Montana, they hadn't been kind to her purse. "Where should I?" She gestured vaguely around the room. Jacob realized he hadn't thought this through. Where did a bought wife sleep? In his bed? on the floor. The whole situation was more awkward than a cat in a doghouse. "The bedroom's through there," he said, pointing to the door where he and Mary had shared so many nights. "I'll sleep out here on the floor." Catherine looked surprised. "That's not necessary. I'm sure we can work out some arrangement that doesn't put you out of your own bed." "It's no trouble," Jacob said quickly. The thought of sharing a bed with this stranger, even a marriage bed, felt wrong somehow. Too fast, too intimate for whatever this was between them. She nodded and picked up her trunk again. "Thank you. That's very considerate." Jacob busied himself rebuilding the fire while Catherine unpacked in the other room. He could hear her moving around, the soft sounds of someone trying to make a space their own. When she emerged 20 minutes later, she'd changed into a simple work dress and tied an apron around her waist. "I should start lunch," she said, surveying the kitchen area with the same careful attention she'd given the rest of the cabin. "What do you usually eat?" "Whatever's handy," Jacob replied, which was the truth. Since Mary died, meals had become fuel instead of pleasure. Bread, beans, whatever was easy and didn't require much thinking. Catherine opened the pantry and made a small sound of distress. The shelves were nearly bare: some flour, a can of beans, a few potatoes that had started to sprout. She picked up each item and examined it like a doctor looking at a sick patient. "When did you last go to town for supplies?" she asked. Jacob had to think about it. "Maybe 3 weeks ago?" "I see." Catherine's tone was carefully neutral, but he could tell she was shocked by how little food he had. "Well, we'll make do with what's here today, but we'll need to make a proper shopping trip soon." She set to work with quiet efficiency, turning the sorry contents of his pantry into something that actually smelled like food. Jacob watched her move around his kitchen, her kitchen now, he supposed, and felt strange about having another person in his space. "You don't have to do this," he said awkwardly. Catherine paused in her stirring. "Do what?" "Cook for me. Clean. Any of it. I know this isn't, you didn't choose this." She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Neither did you," she said finally. "But we're both here now, and we both need to eat." Her practical way of looking at things surprised him. Most women he knew would have been weeping or carrying on about their terrible fate. Catherine just rolled up her sleeves and got to work, as if adapting to strange circumstances was something she'd done before. "Tell me about the ranch," she said as she worked. "How much land? What kind of crops?" Jacob found himself describing his property, the cattle he'd sold, the dreams he'd had for expansion before everything went wrong. Catherine listened carefully, asking smart questions that showed she understood farming better than most city women would. "You worked a farm back east?" he asked. "My father had some land outside Boston. Small place, but I learned the basics." Her hands stilled for a moment. "Before he lost it all in bad investments." There was pain in her voice, old and deep. Jacob recognized it because he carried the same kind of hurt, the loss of everything you'd built, everything you'd counted on. "I'm sorry," he said. "Things happen." Catherine shrugged, but her shoulders stayed tense. "We adapt or we don't survive." Lunch was simple but good, better than anything Jacob had eaten in months. They sat across from each other at the small table, the silence comfortable enough but still strange. Every now and then, their eyes would meet accidentally, and both would look away quickly. "The people in town," Catherine said eventually. "What will you tell them about me?" Jacob hadn't thought about that either. Small towns loved gossip, and a sudden bride would certainly get people talking. "The truth, I suppose, that we got married. But not how we got married. No, not unless you want people to know." Catherine's relief was obvious. "I'd prefer to keep some things private, if that's all right." "Of course." After lunch, Catherine insisted on washing the dishes while Jacob went out to tend to his few remaining chores. When he came back an hour later, he barely recognized his own home. The floors had been swept, the furniture dusted, and curtains he'd forgotten he owned had been washed and rehung. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, amazed at the transformation. "I needed to keep busy," Catherine replied. "Idle hands and all that." That evening they sat by the fire, both reading. Catherine had pulled a worn book from her trunk, something with a fancy title Jacob couldn't pronounce. He found himself watching her read, noting the way her lips moved slightly with difficult passages, the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. "What's it about?" he asked. She looked up, seeming surprised that he was interested. "Poetry. English poets, mostly. Probably not very interesting to most people." "I like poetry sometimes," Jacob said, though he mostly stuck to the Bible and newspapers. Catherine's face lit up in a way that transformed her from pretty to beautiful. "Do you? Which poets?" They talked about books until the fire died down, and Jacob discovered that Catherine Walsh had opinions about everything: politics, literature, farming techniques, the proper way to preserve vegetables. She was smart in a way that made him feel both impressed and slightly intimidated. When it came time for bed, the awkwardness returned. They stood in the main room, neither quite sure how to end the strange first day. "Good night, Mr. Mackenzie," Catherine said formally. "Jacob," he corrected. "If we're going to be, you should call me Jacob." "Good night, Jacob." She hesitated at the bedroom door. "Thank you. For the sleeping arrangements, for being decent about all this." After she closed the door, Jacob made up a bed on the floor using old blankets and a pillow that smelled like loneliness. Through the thin walls, he could hear Catherine moving around, getting ready for bed in what used to be his and Mary's room. As he lay staring at the ceiling, Jacob wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Catherine Walsh was nothing like what he'd expected. She was smarter, stronger, and more complicated than any woman he'd ever met. And despite the circumstances that had brought her here, she was trying to make the best of things. The question was, could two people who'd been bought and sold like livestock ever find their way to something real? Or were they doomed to live like polite strangers, sharing a house but never truly sharing a life? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding Jacob that winter was still coming. But for the first time in months, his house felt warm. Catherine's scream shattered the Montana morning like glass hitting stone, sending Jacob flying from the barn toward the house with his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the front door to find her pressed against the kitchen wall, staring at something on the floor with pure terror in her green eyes. "What is it?" Jacob gasped, his hand automatically reaching for the gun at his hip. "There," Catherine whispered, pointing with a shaking finger toward the corner where shadows gathered thick and dark. Something moved. Something big. Jacob squinted into the dimness and saw it, a brown shape coiled near the wood pile. His blood turned to ice water. Rattlesnake, thick as his wrist and long as his arm, its diamond-patterned back gleaming in the morning light that slanted through the window. "Don't move," he breathed, raising his pistol with steady hands despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Not 1 inch." The snake's head lifted, tongue flicking out to taste the air. Its rattle began that deadly whisper that every Westerner learned to fear. The sound that meant death was measuring the distance between itself and its target. Catherine had frozen like a statue, but Jacob could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest as panic fought with common sense. The shot exploded in the small cabin like thunder, deafening them both. The snake's head disappeared in a spray of blood and wood chips from the wall behind it. The body writhed for a few terrible seconds before going still, but the echo of the gunshot seemed to go on forever. Catherine slumped against the wall, her face white as fresh snow. "Is it dead?" Jacob kept the gun pointed at the snake's remains while he moved closer to make sure. "Stone dead. How did it get inside?" Catherine's voice was small and shaky, nothing like the confident woman who'd been managing his household for the past 3 weeks. Jacob examined the gap between 2 loose floorboards near the corner. "Came up through there, most likely. Looking for somewhere warm now that the weather's turning cold." The fear in Catherine's eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. Anger, maybe, or determination. She pushed herself away from the wall and walked over to look at the dead snake, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "In Boston, the worst thing in my kitchen was mice," she said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "Here, deadly snakes just slither in like they own the place." Jacob found himself almost smiling at her outrage. "Welcome to Montana Territory, Mrs. Mackenzie." The name slipped out before he could stop it. They'd been calling each other Jacob and Catherine, but never used the married titles that were supposed to go with their arrangement. Catherine noticed too, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Mrs. Mackenzie," she repeated slowly, like she was testing how the words felt in her mouth. "I suppose that's what I am now, isn't it?" "If you want to be," Jacob said carefully. "I know this isn't a real marriage, not the way most folks would see it." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the dead snake. When she looked up, something had changed in her expression. "Real or not, I almost died just now, and you saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Catherine said firmly. "Not anyone. You could have let me deal with it myself. Could have said it wasn't your problem." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But you didn't hesitate. You protected me like a husband would protect his wife." The words hung between them like smoke from the gunshot. Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt and loneliness he'd been carrying since Mary died. This woman, this stranger he'd bought with chickens, was looking at him like he was worth something more than a desperate bargain. "We should get this cleaned up," he said, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. They worked together to dispose of the snake and repair the loose floorboard that had let it in. Catherine insisted on helping despite Jacob's protests, handling the bloody mess with a determination that impressed him. This wasn't the delicate city woman he'd expected, but someone who could face ugly realities when she had to. As they scrubbed blood from the kitchen floor, Catherine started talking about her life in Boston. Really talking, not just the careful bits and pieces she'd shared before. She told him about teaching school to children from wealthy families, about her father's gambling debts, about the night she'd come home to find strangers in her house, taking everything to pay what was owed. "I slept in the schoolhouse for 2 weeks, she said, wringing out the bloody rag in a bucket of water. "The headmaster found out and, well, he made me an offer. A place to stay in exchange for services that weren't part of my teaching duties." Jacob's hands stilled on the floorboard he was nailing down. "What did you do?" "I told him what he could do with his offer, using words my father would have been shocked to hear from his educated daughter." Catherine's laugh was bitter as old coffee. "That was the end of my teaching career. No respectable school would hire a woman who'd been dismissed for moral failings." "So you answered Briggs' advertisement?" "I answered an advertisement for domestic help in the Western Territories. I didn't know what I was really signing up for until it was too late to back out." Catherine looked at him directly, her green eyes steady and honest. "I thought I was coming out here to be a housekeeper, maybe a nanny, not a wife bought with poultry." The truth settled between them like dust after a windstorm. Jacob understood now why she'd seemed so shocked that first day, why she'd been so careful to maintain distance between them. She'd been tricked just as surely as he'd been desperate. "Are you sorry you came?" he asked. Catherine considered the question seriously, her head tilted to one side. "Ask me again after I've survived my first Montana winter." That evening, they sat by the fire again, but the comfortable silence they'd developed over the past weeks felt different now. The snake attack had broken down another wall between them, forced them to see each other as more than just two people sharing a house out of necessity. "Jacob," Catherine said eventually, her voice soft in the firelight, "what was she like? Your wife, Mary." The question hit him like a physical blow. Nobody had asked him about Mary since the funeral, as if mentioning her name might bring bad luck or open wounds that were better left alone. "She was," he started, then stopped. How could he explain Mary to someone who'd never met her? She was sunshine in winter, always singing, always finding something to be happy about, no matter how hard things got. "You loved her very much, more than breathing." The words came out hoarse and raw. "When she died, I thought I'd die too. Sometimes I wished I had." Catherine reached over and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that was there and gone before he could think about it too much. "She wouldn't want you to stop living." "How do you know?" "Because love doesn't work that way. Real love wants the other person to be happy, even when it can't be there to share the happiness. Jacob looked at this woman who'd been bought with chickens but spoke about love like she understood its deepest mysteries. Did you ever love someone like that? Once, Catherine said quietly. A young man back in Boston, teacher like me. We were going to be married, but when my father's debts came to light, she shrugged. His family decided I wasn't suitable anymore. Amazing how quickly love disappears when scandal comes calling. He was a fool. Maybe. Or maybe he was just practical. Love is a luxury not everyone can afford. They sat in silence after that, two wounded people sharing the warmth of the same fire, each lost in memories of what they'd lost and wondering what they might yet find. The blizzard hit Jacob's ranch like an angry giant throwing fistfuls of ice and snow, turning the world into a howling white nightmare that made stepping outside feel like walking into the mouth of death itself. Catherine watched from the kitchen window as Jacob fought his way toward the barn, his dark figure disappearing and reappearing in the swirling chaos like a ghost. He's been gone too long, she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the cold glass as wind rattled the cabin walls like it wanted to tear them down board by board. She'd been counting the minutes since he'd left to check on the few animals. They still had 23 minutes in weather that could kill a man in 10. Her hands twisted in her apron as she strained to see through the white curtain that had swallowed up everything beyond the porch steps. A crash of thunder made her jump, though thunder in a snowstorm was as rare as hen's teeth. But this wasn't thunder. It was the barn door slamming against its frame, over and over, which meant it had come loose from its hinges, which meant Jacob was in trouble. Catherine grabbed her heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. The rope Jacob had strung from the house to the barn last week was her only hope of finding him in this white chaos. Without it, she'd be lost in 3 steps and frozen solid before she could find her way back. The cold hit her like a slap from an iron skillet the moment she opened the door. Snow immediately got into her eyes, her nose, her mouth, making it hard to breathe and impossible to see. She grabbed the rope with both hands and started pulling herself forward, one painful step at a time. The wind tried to knock her down with every breath, howling like all the demons in hell had been set loose on the Montana territory. Her feet slipped on ice she couldn't see, and only the rope kept her from falling face first into snow that would have buried her alive. "Jacob!" she screamed, but the wind stole her voice and threw it away into the white nothing. "Jacob, where are you?" The barn was chaos when she finally stumbled through the broken door. Their milk cow stood in the corner, lowing with fear, while the few chickens they'd bought to replace the ones Jacob had traded huddled together like feathered refugees. But no Jacob. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched every corner of the small building. Tools hung in their proper places, hay was stacked neat and tidy, but the man who'd organized it all was nowhere to be found. Then she heard it, a weak voice calling her name from somewhere outside the barn. She followed the sound around to the back of the building, where she found Jacob lying in a snowdrift with his leg twisted under him at an angle that made her stomach turn over. "The wind knocked me down," he gasped through lips that were already turning blue with cold. "Can't get up. Think my leg's broken." Catherine didn't waste time on questions or fear. She'd learned from the snake incident that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford when someone's life was hanging in the balance. Jacob was a big man, much bigger than her, but she'd figure out how to move him or die trying. "Put your arm around my shoulders," she ordered, kneeling in the snow beside him. "We're getting you inside." "Too heavy," Jacob protested weakly. "Leave me. Get yourself safe." "Like hell I will." The curse word slipped out before she could stop it, but she didn't have time to be embarrassed about her language. "You saved my life from that snake. Now I'm saving yours from this storm." Getting Jacob to his feet was like trying to lift a fallen tree, but desperation gave Catherine strength she didn't know she had. He leaned heavily on her shoulder, his weight making her knees buckle, but she gritted her teeth and took one step, then another. The journey back to the house felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes. Jacob's breathing got shallower with each step, and she could feel his body shaking with cold and pain. If she let him fall now, If she gave up or lost her grip on the rope, they'd both die out here in the snow. "Talk to me," she commanded, knowing that if he lost consciousness, she'd never be able to move him. "Tell me about Mary. Tell me about your son." "Mary loved storms," Jacob mumbled, his words slurring with cold. "Said they made the world clean again. Tommy was afraid of thunder, but Mary would sing to him." His voice trailed off, and Catherine felt him starting to sag against her. "Keep talking. Tell me what she sang." "Amazing Grace," Jacob whispered. "Always Amazing Grace." Catherine started singing the hymn herself, her voice barely audible over the wind but strong enough to keep Jacob conscious until they reached the cabin door. Getting him inside and onto the bed was another battle, but finally he was lying on clean sheets while Catherine stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket she could find. His leg was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural bend even through his long underwear. But it was the way his skin looked, white as the snow outside with patches of gray that meant frostbite, that really scared her. "Stay with me, Jacob," she said, rubbing his hands between hers to try to get blood flowing again. "Don't you dare leave me alone in this place." For the next 6 hours, Catherine fought for Jacob's life with everything she had. She heated water and wrapped his frostbitten fingers and toes in warm cloths. She made him drink hot coffee even when he protested that he was too tired. She set his broken leg as best she could, using strips torn from her own petticoat to bind wooden splints around the break. Most importantly, she kept talking to him, keeping him awake and fighting when it would have been easier for him to just close his eyes and drift away. She told him stories about her childhood in Boston, about the students she'd taught, about books she'd read and places she hoped to see someday. "Why are you doing this?" Jacob asked during one of his more alert moments, his eyes focusing on her face with effort. "Because you're my husband?" Catherine said simply, the words coming out before she'd really thought about them. "Because when that snake was about to kill me, you didn't hesitate. Because when I had nowhere else to go, you gave me a home." "A home bought with chickens," Jacob said bitterly. "So what?" Catherine's voice was fierce with conviction. "I don't care how I got here anymore. I care about what happens next. And what happens next is that you get better, because I'm not ready to be a widow." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, something changing in his fever-bright eyes. "Catherine." "Shoo," she said gently, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Save your strength. We'll talk when the storm passes." By morning, the blizzard had blown itself out, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunshine. Jacob's fever had broken sometime during the night, and though his leg would keep him laid up for weeks, Catherine knew he was going to live. As she made breakfast and listened to him sleeping peacefully in the next room, Catherine realized something had changed during those terrible hours when she'd fought to save his life. She wasn't just Mrs. Mackenzie on paper anymore. She was Mrs. Mackenzie in her heart, and that made all the difference in the world. The price of 2 chickens had brought her to this place, but it was love, the kind that grew slowly in the space between desperate strangers, that was going to keep her here. The sound of wagon wheels and laughter drifted across the valley like music from another world, pulling Catherine away from the bread dough she was kneading to peer out the kitchen window. A colorful caravan was rolling up the dirt road toward their ranch, painted wagons bright as flowers, with ribbons streaming from every corner and people in costumes that belonged in fairy tales rather than the Montana territory. "Jacob," she called to the bedroom where he was still recovering from his broken leg. "We have visitors. Strange ones." Jacob hobbled to the window on his makeshift crutches, his face creased with worry. Visitors usually meant trouble, tax collectors, bank agents, or neighbors with complaints. But these people looked like they'd stepped out of a traveling circus. The lead wagon stopped in their yard, and a woman jumped down with the grace of a dancer. She wore a dress the color of autumn leaves, with dark hair that flowed loose around her shoulders and jewelry that caught the sunlight like trapped stars. Everything about her seemed to glow with life and energy. "Good morning, beautiful people," the woman called out in a voice that carried a musical accent Catherine couldn't place. "I am Magdalena Rossi, and we are the Wandering Stars, musicians, storytellers, and bringers of joy to lonely places. Catherine felt her heart skip with excitement. She hadn't seen this much color and life since leaving Boston. The woman's enthusiasm was infectious, making even Jacob's suspicious frown soften slightly. "We seek only shelter for one night," Magdalena continued, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. "In return, we offer entertainment, music, and stories to warm your hearts on this cold spring evening." "We don't have much room," Jacob said carefully, but Catherine could hear the longing in his voice. The long winter had been hard on both of them, filled with worry about his healing leg and the slow passage of days that all looked the same. "Room is not what matters," Magdalena laughed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "What matters is the spirit of hospitality, and I can see you both have generous hearts." Before either of them could object, more people began climbing down from the wagons. There was a tall man with a fiddle case, a woman with hands stained purple from dyeing fabrics, and twin boys who looked like they could juggle fire or walk on their hands without breaking a sweat. "Please," Catherine found herself saying, stepping forward despite Jacob's surprised look. "You're welcome to camp in our yard. We'd be honored to have you." Magdalena's smile could have lit up the entire territory. "Blessings on you, cara mia. Tonight, we shall feast and sing and remember what it means to be alive." The afternoon transformed into something magical as the wandering stars set up their camp. They worked together like a family, each person knowing exactly what to do without being told. Soon, colorful tents dotted the yard. A fire pit appeared surrounded by logs for seating, and the smell of exotic spices filled the air. Catherine found herself drawn into their preparations, helping Magdalena cook while listening to stories about the places they traveled. The older woman had a way of making even ordinary events sound like grand adventures. "You have such sadness in your eyes, Piccola," Magdalena said softly as they chopped vegetables together. "This is not the life you dreamed of, yes?" Catherine's hands stilled on the knife. "Dreams are luxury items. I've learned to live without them." "Ah, but dreams are like seeds," Magdalena replied, her voice warm with understanding. "They can sleep underground for years, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Your seed is still there. I can see it." As evening fell, the wandering stars began their performance. The fiddle player, whose name was Giuseppe, started with a melody so beautiful it made Catherine's chest ache with longing. Then the woman with purple hands, Maria, began to sing in a language Catherine didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly. The music seemed to fill the empty spaces in Catherine's heart, spaces she hadn't even known existed. She found herself swaying to the rhythm, her hands keeping time against her skirt. When she looked over at Jacob, she saw wonder in his eyes, the same wonder she felt blooming inside herself. "Now," Magdalena announced, standing up with dramatic flair, "we invite our hosts to share in the music. Come, cara mia," she gestured to Catherine. "I heard you humming along to Maria's song. You have training, yes?" Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Oh, I couldn't. I used to sing, but that was long ago." "Music is not something you lose," Giuseppe said kindly, his fiddle bow poised and ready. "It lives in here," he touched his heart, waiting for the right moment to come out and play. The group began to encourage her, their voices gentle but insistent. Even Jacob nodded his approval, his eyes warm with curiosity. Catherine felt something stirring inside her, a part of herself she'd buried when her old life ended. "Just one song," she whispered, standing on shaking legs. Giuseppe started to play, and the melody wrapped around Catherine like a familiar embrace. Without conscious thought, she began to sing an old Irish ballad her grandmother had taught her years ago. The words came back as if they'd been waiting patiently for this moment. Her voice started soft and uncertain, but as the song progressed, it grew stronger and more confident. The sadness she'd carried for so long flowed out through the music, making room for something lighter and more hopeful. When the last note faded into the night air, the silence was profound. Then the wandering stars erupted in applause, their faces glowing with delight and appreciation. "Madonna mia!" Magdalena exclaimed, pressing her hands to her heart. "You have a gift, cara. A true gift. Catherine looked at Jacob and saw something in his expression that made her heart race. He was looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like she was someone precious and amazing instead of just the woman he'd bought with chickens. "That was beautiful," he said quietly, and the simple words meant more to her than all the applause in the world. As the evening continued, the wandering stars shared more music and stories. They spoke of cities where opera houses rose like palaces, of mining camps where lonely men paid gold just to hear a woman sing, of the freedom that came from following your dreams wherever they led. "You could come with us," Magdalena said later, when the fire had died down to glowing embers and most of the group had gone to bed. "We travel to San Francisco next, then to the mining towns in California. There is good money to be made, and respect for those who bring beauty to hard places." Catherine felt her heart leap at the possibility, then immediately crash back to earth. "I can't. I'm married. I have responsibilities." "Married to love or married to duty?" Magdalena asked gently. "There is a difference, cara mia." The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Catherine looked toward the house where Jacob was sleeping, his legs still healing, his trust in her still growing. Could she leave him? Should she? Did she owe him her life just because he'd given her shelter? "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Then perhaps it is time to find out," Magdalena said, patting Catherine's hand with maternal kindness. "The heart knows what it wants, even when the mind is confused. Listen to yours, Piccola. Listen carefully." Jacob pretended to sleep as Catherine slipped back into the house, but his mind was racing faster than a spooked horse. Through the thin cabin walls, he'd heard every word of Magdalena's offer, every note of uncertainty in Catherine's voice, as she considered what freedom might look like. The woman who'd sung by the fire tonight wasn't the same person who'd arrived at his ranch with nothing but a battered trunk and wounded pride. That Catherine had been broken, resigned to whatever fate handed her. This Catherine, the one with music flowing through her veins and dreams lighting up her face, deserved better than a life bought with chickens. He listened to her moving quietly through the main room, banking the fire and tidying up from their evening with the wandering stars. She was always taking care of things, always making his life easier and more comfortable. But what was he giving her in return? A cabin that needed repairs, a ranch that barely supported one person, and the love of a man who'd never properly courted her. Love. The word stopped his racing thoughts like a horse hitting a fence. When had his gratitude and companionship turned into something deeper? When had Catherine Walsh become more than just the woman who shared his meals and mended his clothes? Maybe it was the night she'd saved him from the blizzard, fighting through the storm to bring him home. Maybe it was the way she'd argued with him about books, her eyes flashing with intelligence and passion. Or maybe it was tonight, hearing her voice soar over the valley like a bird finally remembering how to fly. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Catherine stepped inside. She moved carefully in the darkness, not wanting to wake him, but Jacob could feel her presence like warmth from a fire. "Catherine," he said softly. She froze, her hand halfway to the chair where she'd been reaching for her nightgown. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I was already awake." Jacob shifted carefully, his healing leg protesting the movement. "Come sit with me." She perched on the edge of the bed, her posture stiff with tension. In the moonlight filtering through the window, he could see the conflict written across her face. Duty warring with desire, safety battling with dreams. "You should go with them," he said quietly. Catherine's sharp intake of breath told him he'd guessed right about her inner struggle. "Jacob, I can't. You're still healing, and the ranch needs someone who wants to be here, not someone who's trapped here." Jacob pushed himself up to sitting, ignoring the pain in his leg. "I heard what Magdalena said about San Francisco, about the mining camps. You could have a real life there. This is my life now." Catherine's voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath. "I made a choice when I came here." "No, you didn't. You were forced into circumstances beyond your control, just like I was." Jacob reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "But now you have a real choice. Maybe the first real choice you've had in years. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers intertwined with his. What about you? What happens to you if I leave? I'll manage. I always have. The words came out rougher than he intended, betraying the fear that was eating at his insides. I survived before you came, and I'll survive after you're gone. That's not living, Jacob. That's just existing. Her words hit him like a physical blow because they were true. Before Catherine, he'd been a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions of living without any real purpose or joy. She'd brought color back to his world, made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. Maybe existing is enough for someone like me, he said bitterly. Maybe I don't deserve anything more. Don't say that. Catherine's voice was fierce now, her grip on his hand tightening. You're a good man, Jacob Mackenzie. You deserve love and happiness and all the things you've been denying yourself since Mary died. Then why does it feel like I'm being punished? The question hung between them like a challenge. Catherine studied his face in the moonlight, and he could see her making some kind of decision. Because you're afraid, she said finally. Afraid to risk your heart again. Afraid that if you love someone, they'll leave you like Mary did. So you keep everyone at arm's length, even me. I don't keep you at arm's length. Don't you? Catherine's smile was sad and knowing. When was the last time you really looked at me, Jacob? Not as your housekeeper or your convenient wife, but as a woman you might actually care about. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd been so careful to maintain distance between them, so determined not to betray Mary's memory, that he'd never allowed himself to see what was right in front of him. I look at you, he said quietly, more than you know. Then tell me what you see. Jacob took a shaky breath and really looked at her. The woman who'd fought through a blizzard to save his life, who'd turned his empty house into a home, who'd filled his evenings with intelligent conversation and gentle laughter. The woman who sang like an angel and dreamed of things beyond the horizon. I see someone who's too good for this place, he said honestly. Someone who deserves concert halls and fine dresses and people who appreciate her gifts. I see someone who's been settling for less than she's worth because she's afraid to reach for more. And what do you want for that someone? The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If he told the truth, that he wanted her to stay, wanted to build something real with her, he'd be asking her to sacrifice her dreams for his comfort. If he lied and said he wanted her to go, he'd be pushing away the only happiness he'd found since Mary died. I want. Jacob started, then stopped. What did he want? For the first time in months, he let himself really think about it. I want you to be happy, he said finally. Whether that's here with me or out there chasing your dreams. I want you to have choices, real choices, not just the leftovers that desperate people settle for. Catherine leaned forward and kissed him gently, a soft brush of lips that tasted like tears and moonlight. Thank you, she whispered against his mouth, for seeing me, for letting me choose. So what will you choose? I don't know yet. Catherine pulled back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But I know I need to figure out what I want, not just what I think I should want. They sat together in the darkness, holding hands and listening to the sounds of the wandering stars settling down for the night. Tomorrow, the colorful caravan would move on toward San Francisco and whatever adventures waited there. Tomorrow, Catherine would have to decide whether to go with them or stay. But tonight, they had this moment, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, finally brave enough to be honest about what they were feeling. Whatever you decide, Jacob said as Catherine finally rose to get ready for bed. Know that you've made these past months the best I've had since Mary died. You've given me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. You've given me things too, Catherine replied softly. A home when I had nowhere to go. Kindness when I expected only duty. And maybe something that could grow into love, given time and the right conditions. As she moved away to change into her nightgown, Jacob lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Love. There was that word again, hanging in the air between them like a promise or a threat. By morning, he would have to let her go or ask her to stay. Either way, his heart was about to break or heal, and he wasn't sure which scared him more. Catherine's hands shook as she folded her few belongings back into the worn leather trunk, each piece of clothing feeling heavier than stone, as she made her choice to leave with the wandering stars. The morning sun streamed through the bedroom window, painting everything golden, but her heart felt gray as winter clouds. "You're really going?" Jacob said from the doorway, his voice flat and careful like he was trying not to show how much it hurt. "I have to know," Catherine replied without turning around, because looking at his face would break her resolve completely. "I have to know what I'm capable of, what kind of life I can build for myself. And you can't find that out here?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to picture herself in 10 years. Still cooking meals for one man, still washing clothes and sweeping floors, still singing only to herself while she worked. The image felt like a cage, even though the man in it had become dear to her. "Here, I'll always be the woman you bought with chickens," she said softly. "Out there, I might be something more." Jacob was quiet for so long that Catherine finally turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, his face a mask of pain and understanding that made her chest ache with guilt. "I never thought of you that way," he said. "Not after that first day." "I know, but I think of myself that way." Catherine sat down on the bed, her trunk forgotten. "Every morning when I wake up, every meal I cook, every shirt I mend, I remember how I got here. I remember that I was worth 2 chickens to a stranger. And sometimes that's all I can see when I look in the mirror." Jacob crossed the room and sat beside her, careful not to jostle his healing leg. "Then maybe you need to look in a different mirror." Before Catherine could ask what he meant, the sound of voices outside made them both look toward the window. The wandering stars were breaking camp, folding their colorful tents and loading their wagons with practiced efficiency. Magdalena stood near the lead wagon, scanning the house with obvious concern. "She's waiting for me," Catherine said. "She's giving you time to be sure," Jacob corrected. "There's a difference." Catherine stood up and walked to the window, watching the organized chaos of the traveling group preparing to leave. Giuseppe was tuning his fiddle while Maria sorted through her collection of scarves and ribbons. The twin boys were practicing juggling moves that would dazzle audiences in the next town. These people had something she'd never possessed, the freedom to go where they wanted, to be who they chose to be. They weren't trapped by circumstances or other people's expectations. They made their own rules and followed their own dreams. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jacob spoke from behind her. "About me being afraid to risk my heart again." Catherine turned, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "You were right," he continued. "I have been keeping you at arm's length. Not because I don't care about you, but because I care too much. Because losing Mary nearly killed me, and I couldn't survive losing someone else I love." The word love hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Jacob, let me finish." He struggled to his feet, balancing carefully on his good leg. "I thought if I kept things practical between us, if I never let myself forget how you came to be here, then it wouldn't hurt so much when you left. And now," Jacob's smile was sad and beautiful at the same time. "Now I realize I fell in love with you anyway, probably sometime between the snake attack and the blizzard. Maybe the moment you looked at me like I was worth something more than a desperate bargain." Catherine felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Why are you telling me this now, when I'm about to leave?" "Because you deserve to know that someone sees your worth. Not the woman who was bought with chickens, but Catherine Walsh, the teacher, the dreamer, the woman with a voice that can make angels weep." Jacob reached out and touched her face gently. "You deserve to know that you're loved for exactly who you are, not for what you can do or what you cost." The tears came then, streaming down Catherine's cheeks like rain after a long drought. "It's not fair," she whispered. "Why couldn't you have said this months ago?" "Because months ago, I was still a ghost haunting his own life. You brought me back to the living, Catherine. You made me remember what it felt like to hope for tomorrow instead of just surviving today." A knock on the front door interrupted them. Magdalena's voice called out cheerfully, "Cara mia, are you ready? The road is calling, and we must answer." Catherine and Jacob looked at each other, both knowing that the moment of decision had arrived. She could walk out that door and chase her dreams across the Western Territories, or she could stay and try to build something real with a man who just opened his heart to her. "What do I do?" she asked, feeling torn between two futures that both seemed impossible. "You choose," Jacob said simply. "You make the choice that feels right in your heart, and don't let anyone, including me, tell you what that should be." Catherine wiped her tears and walked to the front door, Jacob following slowly behind her. The wandering stars were ready to leave, their wagons loaded and their faces bright with anticipation of the road ahead. "Ah, there you are," Magdalena beamed, but her expression grew concerned when she saw Catherine's tears. "What is wrong, Piccola?" "I don't know what to choose," Catherine admitted. "My head says one thing, my heart says another." Magdalena studied her face carefully, then looked at Jacob standing protectively behind her. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, a knowing look that suggested she'd seen the same scene played out many times before. "May I tell you a story?" Magdalena asked, settling herself on the porch steps like she had all the time in the world. "About a young woman who once had to choose between safety and dreams?" Catherine nodded, grateful for any guidance that might help her make sense of the chaos in her heart. This woman lived in a small village in Italy, married to a good man who loved her very much. But she had a voice like yours, cara mia, and dreams of singing in the great opera houses of Europe. Magdalena's eyes grew distant with memory. The choice seemed impossible: stay with love or chase dreams. How could she choose? "What did she do?" Catherine asked, though something in Magdalena's tone suggested she already knew the answer. "She chose both," Magdalena said with a mysterious smile. "She realized that true love doesn't ask you to give up your dreams. It helps you find a way to make them come true." Catherine looked back at Jacob, seeing something new in his expression. Hope, maybe, mixed with determination and the kind of love that wanted the best for someone else, even if it meant sacrifice. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. "I'm thinking," Jacob said slowly, "that maybe there's a third choice we haven't considered yet." Jacob's words hung in the morning air like a challenge to everything Catherine thought she understood about choices and sacrifice. She stared at him, trying to read the expression on his face that mixed hope with something that looked almost like mischief. "A third choice?" she repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. "What if you didn't have to choose between love and dreams?" Jacob asked, his voice growing stronger with each word. "What if there was a way to have both?" Magdalena's eyebrows rose with interest, and the other wandering stars gathered closer, sensing that something important was happening. Giuseppe still held his fiddle, and Maria clutched a handful of scarves, but all attention was focused on the three people standing on the cabin porch. "I don't understand," Catherine said, though part of her was beginning to hope she did. Jacob took a deep breath and stepped forward, despite the obvious pain in his healing leg. "Come with me," he said to Catherine. "Not just to San Francisco with the wandering stars, but everywhere. Let's sell the ranch, take whatever money we can get, and see what the world has to offer." Catherine felt the ground shift under her feet like an earthquake was reshaping the very foundations of her life. "You can't be serious. This ranch is your home, your dream." "This ranch was Mary's dream too," Jacob said quietly. "And she's gone. I've been holding on to something that died with her, trying to keep the past alive instead of building a future." He gestured around the property that had defined his world for so many years. "But dreams aren't places, Catherine. They're not buildings or land or things you can buy and sell. Dreams are what you carry inside you." Magdalena clapped her hands together with delight. "Ah, now this is romantic, like something from an opera." "But your leg," Catherine protested, grasping for practical concerns because the emotional ones were too big to process. "You're still healing, and traveling with the wandering stars means constant movement, sleeping under the stars." "My leg will heal whether I'm here or there," Jacob said. "And if I'm going to be laid up for a few more weeks anyway, I might as well be laid up somewhere interesting." Giuseppe stepped forward, his weathered face creased with a grin. We have room in one of the wagons for a man who needs to rest his bones. And honestly, he added, looking around the ranch with an appraiser's eye, we could use someone who understands animals and farming. Life on the road isn't always easy. You would do that? Catherine asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would really leave all of this behind? Jacob reached out and took her hands, his calloused fingers rough but gentle against her skin. Catherine, this place has been a tomb for me since Mary died. I've been buried here with my grief, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. But you've reminded me what it feels like to be alive. What about money? How would we survive? I'll sell the ranch to the Peterson family. They've been wanting to expand their holdings for years. It won't be a fortune, but it'll be enough to get us started. Jacob's voice grew more confident as he spoke, as if saying the words out loud was making the impossible seem real. And you heard what Magdalena said about the mining camps. There's good money to be made entertaining lonely men who are hungry for beauty and music. Catherine looked around at the ranch that had been her world for the past months. The cabin where she'd learned to cook Jacob's favorite meals, the yard where she'd hung laundry and watched the seasons change, the bedroom where she'd nursed him through his injury and discovered that duty could grow into something deeper. It was a good life, safe and predictable. But it was also small, contained within the boundaries of one man's property and one woman's expectations of what she deserved. Are you sure? She asked Jacob, studying his face for any sign of doubt or regret. Really sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. No returning to the way things were. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Jacob replied, and the conviction in his voice made her believe him. I love you, Catherine Walsh. Not because you cook my meals or mend my clothes or take care of me when I'm hurt. I love you because you're brave enough to dream of something better, smart enough to see possibilities where other people see problems, and strong enough to save a man's life in a blizzard. I love you too, Catherine whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. I think I have for weeks, but I was afraid to admit it because I didn't want to confuse gratitude with something real. And now, Catherine looked into Jacob's eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the safe, small future she'd been settling for, but something bigger and brighter and full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Now I think love and dreams don't have to be enemies, she said. Maybe they can be partners instead. Magdalena let out a cheer that probably woke every sleeping bird in the territory. Bene, bene. This is how love stories should end. Not with settling, but with soaring. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity and decision-making. Jacob sent word to the Peterson ranch about selling his property, while Catherine packed the few possessions that really mattered to her. The wandering stars helped them prepare for a life on the road, sharing practical advice about everything from weatherproofing clothes to finding the best campsites. As the sun reached its peak, Jacob signed the papers that transferred ownership of his ranch to his neighbors for a fair price. The money wasn't enough to make them rich, but it was enough to buy freedom and the chance to discover what they were capable of together. Are you ready, cara mia? Magdalena asked Catherine as they prepared to leave the only home she'd known since Boston. Catherine looked back at the cabin one last time, remembering the frightened woman who'd climbed down from Cornelius Briggs' wagon with nothing but a battered trunk and wounded pride. That woman had been bought with chickens, traded like livestock, reduced to a commodity in someone else's bargain. But the woman climbing into the Wandering Stars wagon was someone different entirely. She was Catherine Mackenzie, wife by choice rather than circumstance, partner in dreams as well as daily life. She was a woman who discovered that her worth couldn't be measured in chickens or coins, but only in the love she chose to give and receive. I'm ready, she said, settling beside Jacob on the wagon seat as Giuseppe clicked to the horses and the colorful caravan began to roll toward the horizon. As they drove away from the ranch, Catherine began to sing. Not the sad ballads of loss and longing she'd favored before, but something new and joyful that seemed to rise from the very depths of her soul. Her voice soared over the Montana Valley, carrying news of love discovered and dreams reclaimed. Jacob joined in with his rougher but heartfelt voice, and soon all the Wandering Stars were singing together as they headed toward San Francisco and whatever adventures waited beyond the mountains. Behind them, the empty ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the last traces of the woman who'd been worth only 2 chickens. Ahead lay a future bright with possibility, where love and dreams could dance together under the endless western sky. The price of 2 chickens had brought them together, but it was love freely chosen and joyfully given that would carry them forward into whatever tomorrow might bring.